while I was still in the faculty at Harvard, I was working as a consultant for President Clinton, working on his so-called race initiative. And a couple of us who were involved in that effort had the thought that for an upcoming speech that the president was scheduled to give, a graduation speech in Portland, Oregon, it would be a good idea to try to get him to give a speech on immigration, a major speech on immigration, which frankly was something I cooked up more as a device to try to force the White House to say something interesting about immigration. So we floated this idea, and a couple days later, the deputy chief speechwriter came back to me and said, okay, that seems to have flown. We're going to do a speech on immigration, but what should it say? And I said, well, why don't you see if you can answer the question, what does it mean to be an American? And she went away, and she came back a couple of days later and said, okay, well, we've been talking about that, and we're not quite sure. One idea we had is that it may mean speaking English. And I said, that can't possibly be right. Go back and think some more. So Maria, you were deputy chief of staff to the president at that point. Could you describe a little bit about how folks at the White House and the president thought through the question of what it means to be an American?
As some folks might remember, the race initiative was partly launched because President Clinton and others really felt that the changing demographics of our country ought to encourage us to take a good look at both our unfinished business of the past and how the future was going to shape up. And so there's probably 8 or 10 people who were working on this race initiative, and on this speech, the question of what is an American was the subject of a lively discussion, and it ranged from people who really had what I would call the high values. What does it mean to be American? It's to support the Constitution. It means support for liberty and freedom and opportunity. And that's what it means to be an American. And then we would say, well, what do you think immigrants think about? Is that what they think when they say, I want to be an American, I'm coming to this country? Is it those, do they share those values? And I challenged some of our colleagues because having grown up as the daughter of immigrants, I know that my parents, as Mexicans and ultimately becoming American citizens, initially felt what does it mean to be American, los Americanos, well, it meant that consumerism and McDonald's and not very strong family values because their children were always out, and whereas their Mexican values meant they always knew where their children were and they were never out in the evenings. And so we had this debate, well, what does it mean to be an American? And as we went to the question of, well, how, for immigrants, we ended up saying there was shared responsibility. Immigrants had a responsibility to learn our political and social values, but also we had a responsibility as Americans to be tolerant and open to the fact that people were coming with many different cultures.
David Montejano, I know you spent a lot of time studying the history of immigration policy and what the stakes have been in immigration policy debates over many years. Is the formulation of policy related to, as it relates to immigration, a constitutive act? Is there a self-conscious act of creating America, of defining America, that takes place through immigration policy? Or perhaps instead is it simply ad hoc political and economic judgments made decade by decade? Or both?
Well, Actually, immigration policy is provides a very interesting insight into the question, into providing this answer to who constitutes an American. I mean, for example, for the longest time, I mean, until relatively recently, until the mid-20th century, Asian Americans were not eligible to become citizens, for example. Well, I mean, that says quite a bit about who is an American or who can become an American. If Asian Americans couldn't become citizens until the mid-20th century, that's sort of an amazing fact when you stop to think about it. Well, what does it say about people who are born in this country who are of Asian descent? The same thing applies to Latinos or Mexicans in particular. I myself, Maria is the daughter of immigrants. I come from Texas, where one branch of my family is one of the founding families of Mexican Texas when it was the northern frontier of New Spain. I mean, nonetheless, I am continually asked, when did my family arrive? When did I cross? So immigration policy directed towards Latinos ends up affecting those of us who consider ourselves very American, but nonetheless find our status always being under scrutiny, always being, essentially put in the, in this ambiguous status. Now, and this is reflected, by the way, in terms of border checks, highway checkpoints and so on. This is something that I grew up with along the U.S.-Mexican border. And we find, I have a lot to say about this topic, but we find that in today's climate about homeland security, for example, these kind of questions about who constitutes an American are highlighted, become emphasized. And not quite recently, a former colleague of Dean Edley's at Harvard, Professor Huntington, for example, published a book called Who Are We? The Challenges to America's National Identity. And Huntington is known for having previously written a book called The Clash of Civilizations, where he posits this clash between the Muslim world and Western civilization. That was his outlook in terms of his global outlook. Yeah. In this book, he's looking internally to look at the challenges to America, and he locates that challenge in the presence, in the inordinate presence of Latinos in this country. That Latinos constitute the basically internal challenge to this country, that we may in fact end up bifurcating the country into two.
So let me jump in there and turn to Michael Nacht as an expert on security matters, and I suppose you're expert at something else too, but it is, no, that's about it? Right. Mars, aren't you an expert on Mars? Yeah, Mars, yeah, okay. So what about the Huntington thesis? And do you see that that the immigration debate and the rising immigration population of immigrants in the U.S. creates the possibility for an internal clash of civilization that throws into question what is American?
Well, those are great questions. First of all, Huntington has been prolific over 40 years, so there are many Huntington theses on many subjects. I'd like to step back for 1 minute just to say the following. I think in a democracy, there's an inherent and permanent tension between civil liberties, which include immigration policy issues, and national security issues. Let me just briefly characterize the 1990s. And I'll just, for argument's sake, say that was a period in the U.S. of low perceived threat. And there are many problems around the world. And maybe if you were a Mexican trying to get into the United States, it wasn't low perceived. But in general, most Americans did not feel that America was under attack directly in the 1990s. Cold War was over. It wasn't clear what to even call the world. We would call it the post-Cold War world because we didn't know where we were in. At that time, there tends to be high tolerance for civil liberties. So, for example, if Michael Nacht was late from a class to a flight at SFO on September 10th, 2001, and said, look, I'm sorry I'm late, but, I need to get on this flight, you know, it's only 20 minutes before the flight. You know, I had some chance of getting on the flight. You know, there was no particular reason to give me a hard time, or any of you, I would think. But if I try to do that today, or any time after September 11th, I have to take off my belt, they smell my socks, they ask me all kinds of questions. They are infringing on my civil liberties. There's no doubt about it. And they're infringing on everybody's civil liberties who goes through those security checkpoints. But there have been policies put in place, and there's kind of an acceptance by the public, by most of the public, for these policies, because since, well, we're in a new situation of perceived threat, and therefore we can tolerate some constraints on civil liberties. But it's not like engineering, my original field. There's no answer in the back of the book. There's no way to determine for one and for all time, what is the appropriate set of infringements and what's the inappropriate. So it's an endless debate, and this is part of that. This is part of that discussion. And I would say, as long as in the United States and among those who we have elected, there is a belief that we are under a sense of greater threat, then there will be a continuous effort to constrain civil liberties in a sense abnormally from what we experienced in the 1990s. That's a somewhat separate matter from all the questions that Huntington has raised. I certainly hope, as a citizen, just as a human being, that we don't have internecine warfare here in the United States. But clearly tensions are rising. I think that's...
Well, say a little bit more about that. Do you think the fact of large immigrant populations is influencing public perceptions of the nature or dimensions of the security risk?
I'm personally dubious, but not... members of the Bush administration, members of Congress are not so dubious. In other words, let me give you a concrete example. There's actually quite a lot of ambiguity about American knowledge of the current status of al-Qaeda. I can go into that in a lot of detail. I won't bother you with that. But it was alleged recently, within the last 2 months, that a person who the intelligence community has long identified as the likely successor to Muhammad Atta. Muhammad Atta was the leader of the 9/11 attack, of the 19 hijackers who slammed into the World Trade Center in the Pentagon, killed 3,000 Americans. That person, who they think they know him, they have pictures of him, they know about his educational background, they know a lot about him, was seen crossing the Mexican border into California on more than one occasion. So that has been fed back to the Immigration Naturalization Service and Department of Homeland Security. And I think that's one of the reasons that they're tightening up on just the regulations regarding the flow across the border. So now you've probably read that there's an effort underway so that all Americans have to show their passport going into and out of Mexico and Canada in a way we didn't have to before. You know, you show a driver's license or something, it's not show anything, just have a car.
Let me turn to Lucas. The intersection between our legitimate concerns and our not-so-rational anxieties about security, on the one hand, and the debate about the status of immigrants and the course of immigration policy. At the intersection of those two, tell me how you think it's shifted since 9/11, and whether you're feeling hopeful about the current direction of the discussion.
I'm not particularly hopeful, to answer that part of the question first, excuse me. And I do think it's true that clearly external circumstances and how confident we feel as a country affects how we respond to immigration. How confident we feel economically, how confident we feel politically, how confident we feel in terms of our national security. That has a profound effect. It always leaks over into our response to immigration and immigrants generally. And I think we've always had two strands in our nation's history. There's everything that's symbolized by the Statue of Liberty, and what we believe and what we want to believe is a value as a nation and a nation of immigrants. That's truly part of our heritage. It's a very important part. It's something we all celebrate. And there's always been the element of fear, of xenophobia, and of racism that's anti-immigrant. And the question is which predominates at any particular time, because they're always both present. And when we're confident, we're more welcoming, and when we're not, we're less. And there's a lot of things that can generate that fear and that lack of confidence. And I think post 9/11, we clearly are in a period of fear about a lot of things. Some of it's rational, some of it's not. And so I think in part what we're seeing is a response to the rational fear and the need for greater security, although it's interesting that in today's paper, in today's New York Times, it said that after 9/11, the security screening at the airports is no better than it was pre-9/11, that all the studies have shown, a recent study that's about to come out by the GSA or by someone else who's looked at it, I don't know who, is going to show that it's no different. And that's kind of a shocking revelation because it's true. We go through much greater screening, and I think all of us feel comfortable going through that, but we assume that it helps and that it makes a difference. And if it doesn't make a difference, then the question is why. And that's just a kind of a little paradigm, because I don't think anyone objects to going through the screening. But if that's representative of the other ways in which we're being asked to make sacrifices, and if it's not having any benefit, then you have to really question it. And the greatest mistakes we've made as a nation in terms of civil liberties have come at precisely times like this. So we have to look at measures with great skepticism and with great scrutiny. That doesn't mean they're all wrong, but we have to be very careful not to accept them. And just a few days ago, Fred Korematsu died. Fred Korematsu, who challenged Japanese-American internment during World War II, and he, if anyone, symbolizes the kinds of mistakes we make when fears of security trump civil liberties, and when we don't apply that scrutiny that I think we absolutely have to.
So right now, well, it's Saturday, but
On Monday.
on Tuesday, Congress, the Senate will be debating some immigration measures.
Well, that's
And it sounds from everything that really all four of you have been saying as though this is just about the worst possible time to be trying to make immigration policy, if indeed there are both legitimate and perhaps less legitimate anxieties about the security threats. This can't be a good thing. Maria?
It's a very wrong time to try to do immigration policy.
What's going on? What are they going to be arguing about?
It's actually, the 9/11 Commission came out with a set of recommendations, legislation that they proposed, and some of you may remember in November and December after the election, Congress passed. A Congressman, Sensenbrenner, wanted to attach his border security issues to that intelligence bill, called Real ID. And actually, by the name, it sounds Real ID. It must do something about security, right? Well, it doesn't. It is now attached to the Iraq supplemental aid for troops in Iraq. And Sensenbrenner got a vote in the House, and the Senate's going to debate it on Tuesday. And what does Real ID? It sets federal standards for driver's license. It makes it harder for people fleeing persecution to get asylee or refugee status in this country. It also sets a bounty hunter, so that if you are a bail bondsman or someone who believes that there are immigrants who are under orders for deportation, you can, in fact, get paid for turning them into to the authorities. So the important thing, they say it's border security and not immigration, and yet all the analysis has shown that even if the provisions were enacted, wouldn't have stopped a single one of the 19. So it's all about fear. And but what it will do is terrorize a lot of people who are here, 8, 9, 10 million people who are working in this country. And indeed, one last point, on the driver's license, professor at West Point, Margaret Stock, wrote that it's actually a stupid idea to limit driver's licenses only to U.S. citizens, because you have, the DMV has the largest, best databases. This is a way of actually knowing who people are and where they live. So if you're really trying to get information so that you know who's out there, Why would you cut off a chunk of that population if you're really trying to protect our country?
Michael, let me turn back to you. From what you heard, are there useful things you think that could be done, that should be done, to tighten up on border security, to tighten up on our surveillance of immigrants within the U.S. that have a legitimate security payoff?
I think it's very tough. You know, I think there are things that can be done to strengthen our borders, but they're not necessarily related solely to immigrants. For example, port security remains a huge area of vulnerability for the United States, but that's more about having the right kind of technologies in place, so we have a much better, and other procedures, and even having inspectors in other ports elsewhere, so we have a much more confident sense than we do now of what's actually coming into our ports, which, as you, I'm sure, know, are hugely influential in the life of our economy, both imports and exports, and is a very easy way for people with malevolent intent to do great damage to this country very easily. That really has nothing to do with the immigration issue. I think the immigration issue is, you know, it's so wrapped up in so many different dimensions of state, local, and national politics that it's going to be hard for any administration, although this administration may be more effective than most because they have such an alignment of power within the system. In fact, let me footnote, I've been around a while, and I would say today, this is the weakest, in my view, the weakest the Democratic Party has been in my lifetime at the national level, without any question whatever. I'm not applauding it, but I'm just observing it. I mean, okay, I didn't hear the previous session. I don't know what Bruce Kane and other electoral politics experts said. But what that tells you, though, if that assertion is right, and the vast majority of Republicans are more interested in emphasizing if there's a fight between national security and immigration policy, they're going to weigh more on the side of national security, then you know in advance how these debates are going to come out, no matter what, you know, some others might think, and they're going to weigh on the side of tightening things up, thinking that even if not all these policies really work, it's better to have more of them rather than fewer of them. So really, to me, the key issue is for what you might call the more moderate wing of the Republican Party that's represented in the House and Senate. Those are the key people in the United States, and it's not that many of them.
All three of them, right.
All three of them. I mean, the Senate, it's Collins and Chafee and a few others. In the House, it's a somewhat larger group. You know, they are the people you have to reach if you want to have policies implemented or blocked that you think are sensible.
Well, let me push this a little and pose it to all of you, since Michael raised the P word. Thinking of this in political terms, is it the case that by and large the Republican Party has become, in these respects, the party of security, of border protection, whereas Democrats are the party of an inclusive, pro-immigrant America? Is that the characterization that's, Lucas?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is, leaving aside just for a moment the security immigration dichotomy, in terms of immigration policy generally, I think it's one of the issues, one of perhaps not that many, one of the issues that doesn't divide neatly along Democratic-Republican lines. The immigration debate and the immigration policy and what kinds of immigration policies we ought to have is one that divides the Republican Party and it divides the Democratic Party. And so you can have someone like Grover Norquist, who is super conservative on lots of Republican issues, who nonetheless is very supportive in many instances of immigration reform.
Why?
Well, I think it's for free market reasons. There's the kind of what I would call, but others are, you know, sort of more steeped in this than what I call sort of the Wall Street Journal wing of the Republican Party, who favor immigration because, for the same reason that they favor generally open markets and free flow of capital, free flow of labor, and less regulation of the economy generally, including less regulation of the workforce generally, which includes more accessibility to more immigrant labor. And that's one strong aspect of the Republican Party that's in tension with the more restrictionist elements of the Republican Party. And you have similar kinds of divisions within the Democratic Party. So I think when we talk about immigration policy generally, separate for the moment from this immediate issue of national security, it's very, very complicated in terms of the political dynamics. And then you put the overlay of national security on top of it, and it becomes even more difficult, and it's more difficult to have an informed debate about immigration policy when it gets infected with national security. And those who are restrictionists to begin with and want to have less immigration for all sorts of, in my view, nefarious reasons, xenophobia, fear, racism, and so on, this climate provides an opportunity to exploit the national security concern to further an agenda that's against immigration, and that further makes it even more difficult to have a real substantive debate about what is good immigration policy from the point of view of the national interest, from the point of view of individual rights, from the point of view of our economy, and so on.
I think Lucas is correct. I mean, the Republican Party is split on the issue of immigration, and we only have to think of a time before 9/11 to the 1990s, when you have, in California, for example, Governor Pete Wilson leading the charge on Proposition 187, an basically anti-immigrant measure. At the same time that you have Governor George Bush in Texas telling the party, the Republican Party, there will be no Mexico bashing, and you have George Bush coming out in favor of bilingualism and so on. Now here we have at the time, two stellar figures in the Republican Party, I think, reflecting the division within that party. And that still persists to the present day for the reasons that Lucas pointed out. You have the Wall Street Journal of the Republican Party that favors, free flow of capital, labor, and so on.
Maria?
I want to get us back to sort of how this debate, national security, immigration, actually really over time is going to challenge us in sort of what is an American. And I want to preface that, having received CIA briefings every morning when I worked in the White House, the world is very scary. And most people didn't know that before 9/11. Now we do. So there is a national function of looking to secure our country. At the same time, one of the things that many people would argue that makes America such a desirable place is our freedom to be able to move and no one challenge, and not having to actually prove that you need to go someplace, or for most of us, not all of us. And I think in the years to come, we are really going to be challenged. What is the balance that we want? Because we want to be secure and we want to be safe, but what part of our population is going to bear the brunt of having to prove that they have a right to be here or to be able to enjoy what we consider to be our societal benefits?
Michael?
Let me offer one concrete example of, I think, just what Maria's talking about. I have two sons. My oldest son is an attorney, a civil rights attorney, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I'm sure many of you know that Michigan has a very large, relatively speaking, large Muslim population. Actually, it's per capita, I think, the largest in the United States, and the Detroit metropolitan area is the largest single concentration of Arab Americans in the United States, and the largest single concentration of Iraqi Americans and Iraqis. Okay, and Dearborn, Michigan, which is not too far from Ann Arbor, I don't remember the precise numbers, but it's somewhere 40% Muslim. Well, after 9/11, there were judgments made by the Bush administration, and after, remember that shoe bombing incident that was thwarted Richard Reed, who was a Caucasian but had converted to Islam and had been very active in mosques in London. It was judged that if there really are al-Qaeda cells in the United States, or certainly al-Qaeda sympathizers in the United States, Muslims who really want to kill innocent Americans, that they would plausibly be congregating in mosques in the United States. They wouldn't be going to temple. They wouldn't be going to Roman Catholic services. They wouldn't be going to Episcopal services. They'd be going to mosques. And what the FBI requested was, I don't know all the details on this, but I think, roughly speaking, that every mosque in the United States, and we have thousands, because we have over 7 million Muslims in the United States, every mosque be surveilled, and I guess quite a lot of them be bugged. Now, we have a right for freedom of assembly in this country. We're allowed to come together as this group. No one has, I didn't have to call my congressman or the police and say, I want to come to Berkeley and meet with some other people, right? So Muslims have every right in this country to assemble freely, and in fact, President Bush has said Muslims are freer in America than in any Muslim country in the world. That's his assertion. So there's a concrete issue. Do you, in a way, infringe differentially on the Muslim population or on some subset of the Muslim population out of this national security concern? Or do you say, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable in the United States?
David, what's the answer to that question? Why not surveil mosques? If you think that if you have credible evidence that there are al-Qaeda cells operating somewhere within the U.S.?
Can I be your lawyer for a
Go
second?
ahead, go
You
ahead.
made a big assumption right there. Credible evidence. I mean, assume for a
Well, I mean, in the
moment-
same sense that there were credible evidence of weapons of mass destruction in
What about, how did we surveil all the Catholic churches when we were in the fight against the Italian mob? It's too broad, it's too sweeping, and it's too dangerous. There's the over-inclusiveness of that, there's always this temptation.
So if there were only 500,000 Muslims in America rather than 7 million, it would be okay?
No, I think that to the contrary. I think that if there's a particular, to go back to the mafia example, there was a war on the mafia for, I guess, several decades, and Italian Americans understandably objected to everyone being painted with the same brush, and we never suggested that every Catholic or every Italian American.
I'm sorry, I missed the Italian terrorists who blew up buildings and killed 3,000 people. I missed that incident. Was that?
I missed it as well.
Well, but then are you suggesting that Al Capone and Osama bin Laden are morally equivalent?
No, I'm not suggesting they're morally equivalent, but what I'm suggesting is to take an innocent and legitimate belief in religion or anything else, but in this case we're talking about religion, and to say that because a particular person or group has that characteristic, that therefore we're going to use that as the criterion for investigating or scrutinizing or infringing on the rights of everyone who has that same characteristic.
Well, I thought if we're talking about surveilling, so you're saying that you would not even think it appropriate for an FBI agent or a police detective to stand outside the mosque, watch who goes in and out, and compare it with pictures from a watch list of terrorists?
Well, I think if the police wants to, or the FBI wants to see whether there's someone somewhere who matches a particular identity of a terrorist, I think that's fine. That's police activity, that's investigative techniques. We're looking for a particular person, and we'll look where we think that person goes.
Michael?
Just an anecdote on why it's tough. I was watching recently, I love to watch reruns of old movies. So I was watching The Day of the Jackal. I don't know how many of you know this film. It's about an assassination attempt in France against de Gaulle by Algerian separatist people. And actually, for those of you who don't know that film, it's a great film, but there's a remake with Bruce Willis, who you do know, just in the late 90s, called The Jackal. It's not as good, but it's not bad. Okay. All right, so let's go back to The Day of the Jackal. They bring in a top cop in France, in Paris, brilliant guy, and he's going to try to figure out, there's a guy who's going to assassinate de Gaulle, they know that. They're calling him the Jackal. They don't know who he is, they don't know anything about his identity, whatever. And then they learn that in this tight group of like 15 people who are making all the decisions in France about how to protect de Gaulle, there's a leak.
Right.
So, there's this poignant scene. The inspector walks in, to this government meeting, very important meeting, and he plays a tape. And on the tape, you hear a voice from someone in the group saying to somebody else, you know, they're really trying to do this and that and this and that. So, and then this man stands up and he said, Mr. Minister, I am the person. He was living with someone, telling her what was going on. Late at night, he was telling her what was going on in the meetings, and she was reporting to the Algerians. I don't know if anything I've just said is clear, but here's the punchline. Here's the punchline. So then the minister said, brilliant, you found the leak. How did you know which of the 20 of us was the source for the Algerians? And he said, I didn't know. So they said, well, how did you find out? He said, I tapped everybody's phone. So that's the question. That really is the question. If there's ambiguity, you don't know, so okay, what do you do? Do you say, let's pick 3? Do you do it to every, so he was essentially, that man is, let's assume that's a real story for a second, not just in the film. He's infringing on the civil liberties of the 20 top ministers in France,
Yeah,
because one of them is...
But they're French. I mean,
No, but that's an example. And my hunch is, I wasn't involved in any of this, but my hunch is the FBI is saying, we've got all these mosques, we don't know, you know, first of all, we don't know if there are any of them, any Muhammad Attas in any of these mosques, but we can't be sure. Let's bug them all.
David, do you have a problem with FBI
I just want
standing
to point
outside
out
the mosque?
that, you know, we've been involved in previous wars, and I'm struck by the differential treatment of so-called suspect populations. I mean, in World War II, we were fighting the Germans and the Italians. Were there any roundups of German Americans or Italian Americans, much like there were of the Japanese Americans? No.
Italians,
No, not wholesale.
not wholesale, but some.
Not into internment.
I'm talking about entire
not into
communities
internment
being
camps,
rounded
right.
up,
Yeah.
you know?
Right, so...
I mean,
Very, right. So, but, okay, so, but so
let's
you got off
just-
the, you got,
just-
no, but hold on, but David, answer my question, though. What about the mosques? What about surveillance of mosques? So your answer is no? Or your answer is, I'd rather talk about World War II?
I'm not an intelligence officer or security person. I'm more into looking into the sociological implications of these policies. I mean, the FBI will do what it's going to do. It's been doing what it's been doing. It did it during the civil rights movement. I mean, how many of us have files?
Well, let me ask you, let me ask you
So,
this, and is
what-
it different? Is this question different from the question of whether or not the Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, formerly INS, should be able to walk around in a bowling alley on Saturday night at a bowling alley 30 miles from the southern border and ask people to show some ID? At least ask the brown-skinned people to show some ID, searching out possible criminal behavior. That's clearly wrong in your judgment, right?
Yes.
And let's, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So isn't standing outside the mosque clearly wrong? Maria, let me go to Maria.
The answer is yes, but it depends on, I expect my law enforcement agencies to be doing basic police work. And if evidence or some credible basis for concluding that a particular mosque may be the scene of some activity that warrants increased surveillance, I would expect my law enforcement agency to follow up on that.
A particular mosque.
What I'm saying is to have some evidence that that something's going on somewhere, but a wholesale, everyone who's Muslim in every mosque, it's also incompetent. It's like racial profiling.
Yeah.
You stop every black person and brown person searching for drugs, and you're not actually, and all the studies show, doesn't mean you're finding more drugs or finding more criminal activity. So it's not effective police work.
What is it that FBI, let's be a little bit more specific, what is it that FBI agent is doing? You know, standing outside, monitoring everybody who's going in and out? No. What does that achieve? Looking for a particular suspect because the person lives in the neighborhood and might be attending that mosque? Sure, that's good police work. Going in and participating in religious services to observe what's being said, FBI agents, I guess, can attend religious services like anyone else, but monitoring everything that's being said, creating files, reporting on what everybody says, no. So it really depends. What is it that the person is doing, towards what end, and based on what suspicion? And I think also we need to keep in mind, what's the impact of all of this? Is it effective not only in terms of the policing, but what does it do to the community that is being singled out? Because I think it's easy for us to forget that the Muslim and the Arab community in this country was just as much a victim of the attacks of 9/11 as all the rest of us. Every single person was attacked by the terrorists. And just to finish the point, that if what we say is you are different than the rest of us for some reason, but we want you to cooperate with us, the police, when we ask you questions, when something suspicious arises in your community, when you have reason to believe that there actually is someone dangerous in your community, then you're discouraging the very thing that we want to encourage, namely the cooperation of the community that shares with us the same values, and instead saying, you don't share the values, we don't want you, we suspect you, and rather than getting the help of that community, we
So just if I can add a little connective tissue so that I can create the illusion of coherence here. One could certainly argue that at stake in this question is, well, who is an American? And what are the incidents of being an American? And actually, if you're not an American, then maybe having some heightened scrutiny of you, of your community, is perfectly appropriate. Or certainly, if there is heightened scrutiny of you, then it may give you cause to feel as though you're not being treated as though you are an American, whatever that means. Now, Michael said earlier that our history is one of continuing balance and rebalancing between the claims of security on the one hand and the claims of civil liberties on the other. I think implicitly he was suggesting that the reality is that post 9/11 that a different balance is being struck from the one that was struck in the 90s. Well, Lucas, let me go back to you, given your last comment. Do you think 9/11 made any difference whatsoever in the way we ought to strike the balance between civil liberties and security concerns?
Well, I think I agree. We're constantly recalibrating that. And as I said, for example, at the airport, I agree. We're subjected to greater scrutiny now than we used to be. And I, for one, and I don't even know if my own organization agrees with what I'm about to say, but let me just say, I, for one, am glad. If it's more effective and it's better, let's make it efficient, let's make it safe, and let's make everybody, and let's protect everyone. But I think there ought to be certain tests for how we decide how that recalibration ought to be implemented. And I think one of the tests ought to be, are we willing to subject ourselves to whatever it is that we're asking others in our society to be subjected to? And that, I think, is a critical question. And if we are, then it still may not be where we as a society ought to be. It's not the only test, but it seems to me it's one of the tests. And if what we're saying is the Arab or the Muslim community in our country will be treated differently because of religion or because of ethnicity, then that, to me, fails that initial test.
What about treated differently because some group being treated differently because they are not citizens?
There are certain things in respects to which non-citizens can be treated differently, specifically in terms of entering the United States. There's no doubt about that. That's part of what we as a country recognize, who's a citizen, who's entitled to enter, and so on. and the scrutiny to which non-citizens are subjected is completely different than that to which citizens are subjected. In terms of individuals in the United States, it depends on whether it relates specifically to their right to be here or in relation to other matters, whether it deals with the fairness with which they're treated and so on. I mean, just to make the basic point, the Constitution says that every person is entitled to due process of law. It doesn't say every citizen. It says every person is entitled to due process of law. So the fundamental protections of the Constitution have to apply to every person in the United States. That doesn't mean that someone here who's in violation of the immigration laws can't be deported. They can be, but they're entitled to a fair procedure. They're entitled to notice of what that violation is. They're entitled to defend themselves in that proceeding. They're entitled to have a court look and decide whether the government has violated the law in arresting or deporting them, and so on. So there are differences, but they can't be singled out for questioning because of the color of their skin or because of their ethnicity.
Maria, what about this balance post 9/11? Is it different? Is it necessarily different?
It is different because I think the concern and the need for security. There are a lot of threats to this country because of what America symbolizes. But unfortunately, our past history, and I want to go back to something that Avid said that really goes to the question of what is an American. We keep defining it, and at times we use race and ethnicity to say folks are not Americans. That is why, for example, most people don't know that during the Great Depression, there was a massive deportation of Mexicans, almost 1 million people. 60%, Professor Kevin Johnson up at UC Davis, 60% of those deported were born in the United States. Lives were changed. People didn't come home. 1 million people. 60%, U.S. citizens. We didn't care, the broader we, because they were Mexican.
What was the justification for that?
Because, well, depression, and the justification was there was a lot of illegal people here, and so they just rounded up anybody who looked Mexican. Well, we did that with the Japanese.
Draining the welfare system, that kind of stuff.
Right, the same things we're hearing now. I mean, and the focus with the internment of the Japanese Americans, third generation, suddenly they're, suspicion. So if our past history shows that we don't balance this particularly well, and given the current climate, to me, where we're going to is very much in the communist Red Scare, potentially where you're really having people check and people become really afraid. And the problem is most of America I believe, most of America is willing to pay that kind of increase, the price for increased surveillance, because they think it's not going to be directed to them. It's going to be directed to people who look different.
Let me shift gears and head in a slightly different direction. I began by talking a little bit about Clinton's race initiative, and let me return to that for a moment. One of the themes that informed that initiative, and that was really the impetus for it, was this slogan of One America. And much of the rhetoric that Clinton used in '96 and throughout his second term about One America related to our diversity and finding ways to not just tolerate but celebrate our diversity, not unlike, frankly, some of the speeches we've heard from the new chancellor at Berkeley. But he often did this in a way that contrasted America's experience and challenge with that of societies elsewhere in the world in which racial, ethnic, religious, tribal differences have led to violent turmoil. Now, Michael, I was wondering if you would comment, and perhaps, David, you can do this as well, about whether it is, or the extent to which it may be legitimate for immigration restrictionists, or let me not use that pejorative, people who are concerned with the level of undocumented aliens here in the country, for them to say that, look, the border is too porous, It's unregulated. Immigration is surging. Look at the experience of other countries when they have large immigrant populations, when they have sort of uncontrolled, unconstrained diversity. It's destabilizing. It's destabilizing. And therefore, it's appropriate for the United States to try to limit immigration, to try to insist upon linguistic and other kinds of cultural assimilation, so that the United States can avoid the trauma created by difference in so many other countries throughout world history. Michael?
So I think this is really one of the core issues, because even more than other countries, France or Britain, America was founded by immigrants. Right? I mean, the whole essence of America was people fleeing bad situations to come here. Now we've set up a pretty decent shop for about 4 out of 5 people, roughly, right? 80% of the American people have been doing pretty well, 20% are not doing well. And now, after 225 years, saying, you know what, this is just about the right balance. Let's sort of constrain our future policies in this direction. And it goes counter to the fundamental ethos of the United States. So I think, as I said, some people are interested in constraining because of national security, but I think others, and maybe the majority of people who are immigrant constrainers, are really not so much into national security, or they're using the national security argument for a different reason. And that different reason is they can look at the demographic data, just like our colleagues here, and they say, you know what? The days of the Caucasian majority in the United States is, the sun is setting on it. It's ending. It may not, we may get it wrong by 20 years. It's over. Because all you have to do is look at the flow of people coming in, the vast majority of whom are not Caucasian. You look at the birth rates of the people who are here, Caucasian versus non-Caucasian. You don't have to, have a PhD in mathematical statistics to figure it out. And they don't want that. And they don't want everything that portends. So, here I'm just I'm diagnosing the behavior. I personally don't think it's going to be easy for the United States, whoever the United States is, to constrain it, because of our special origins. And I bet if I went to sleep, which could happen at any moment, and woke up in, let's arbitrarily say, 130 years, 150, whatever, I don't know, maybe that number's wrong, but some other number, I would bet that the Caucasian majority would be a minority. I don't think the immigrant constrainers are going to prevail in this, because it's unless we have more attacks. You see, if there are more attacks, then the national security issue and all of its manifestations can be used as a key argument, and people will say, okay, you got to do what you got to do. We can't know which one, we bug them all. But if we have a kind of peaceful world, which doesn't seem all that likely in the future, but it could happen, then I think, if the differential birth rates continue and the immigration policies, I think, will be hard to constrain, then that'll just change. But you know what? From my view, it won't be the end of the world. That's the thing. But I can't prove it till we reconvene in 130 years.
Part of this argument is linked with this notion that somehow the melting pot dynamics of this country have failed or are about to fail, that this country can no longer absorb these recent immigrants. Well, of course, that's erroneous. It's part of the hysterical thinking that we hear, and we've been hearing that began before 9/11, and of course has picked up in tempo now. I would say that 9/11, unfortunately, is diverting us away from other kind of threats that we ought to look at, not external but internal. Before 9/11, we had the Oklahoma City bombing. I don't know if you recall the initial reports on that bombing. They were looking for a Muslim suspect. It turns out to be a homegrown American product. That's right. I think we ought to be concerned about these groups that wrap themselves around the flag and claim super patriotism and then go down and monitor the border on their own. These are the kind of armed groups that we ought to be concerned about as well.
So how would you prove to a sincere and rational person concerned about levels of immigration that increasing diversity is not a threat to his or her way of life, quote unquote? Or would you simply assert you have no right to try to hold on to your way of life? David?
I would point to Governor Schwarzenegger as an example. As an immigrant who, there's several. Look, what do we want to look at? The crowded English-speaking schools that immigrants are crowding into. I mean, do we want to look at language rates? Do we want to look at some intermarriage rates? Intermarriage rates. How about joining the armed forces and fighting our country's wars? I mean, which indicator do we want to look at? All of them indicate that immigrants are ready to become, and actually are even are willing, are eager to prove their dedication and commitment to this country. There's no question about that.
Lucas?
And I guess I would add to that the sweep of American history. To me, it's always been like this. Every group of immigrants has been treated with suspicion, scorn, discrimination. It happened when when the Germans started coming, and the English, and Benjamin Franklin, famously said, this is going to become a German-speaking country. They're not assimilating. They're keeping their own languages. They're printing their own newspapers. And then when Southern Europeans started migrating to the United States in significant numbers, the Italians and the Greeks were treated with discrimination. The Irish, we all know from history, when the Irish were discriminated against.
Okay, but hold on. But that was then and this is now. Aren't there important differences in the nature of immigration today?
I would suggest not. That I think that what we do and what we are tempted to do always is to look at immigration as kind of this historical artifact rather than as an ongoing dynamic process. And every group of immigrants has come to the United States, has changed the United States, and has in turn been changed itself. And we're a very different country today than we were in the 1700s and the 1800s. I would say that's great. That's a strength. Thank God. And we will be a different country 100 years from now. And that, too, I think, is something to celebrate. So it's not that the situation's going to remain unchanged, but the country and its values, and to go back to your original theme, it's interesting. What is an American? It is precisely, in my view, those values. It's not an ethnicity. It's not a tribe. It's not a group. It's a dedication to those values. And when I was growing up, my father was a refugee from Nazi Germany. And that's what he, more than anything else, imbued in me. What's different about the United States is what makes us a coherent whole are the values as a nation that we have, not what our ethnicity or our religion was and is. And that, I think, is...
Okay. Before I want to invite some questions or comments from the audience, but just one last thing, because Maria, I have heard you say something somewhat different. So let me point to two things. What's wrong with somebody asserting, no, I don't buy it. I don't want to think of America as a process. I want to think of America as a snapshot. Here's the family portrait. I want to freeze frame it. And secondly, isn't immigration today, in terms of globalization, in terms of narrow casting of the media and so forth, isn't immigration today and the prospects for assimilation markedly different from immigration in generations past?
First, with respect to freezing sort of the family portrait, you can't do it. It can't happen. It is a dynamic process. And I want to underscore what Lucas said. One of what makes us unique, really, is that but for the Native Americans, you look at, there was always a France before France finally had its revolution. There were people who lived in a particular spot. India, 3,000, there were people there, and there's a continuity. Our country really is a dynamic from day one. But what makes this immigration wave, I think, more challenging are two things. One is the ease of travel. For the last century, a big chunk of people came really with a sense, a belief that they weren't going to be able to go back to the home country, and therefore made sort of a psychic decision. Okay, I'm learning English. I'm not teaching my children Italian. I'm not teaching them German. We're going to be American. Well, and then communications, letters. What do we have now? You can travel back and forth, easy, and not always that expensive. And you've got communications and channels, and from a number of different countries. So you're constantly able to hold on to a language. And so I think that those two facts, ease of travel and communications, does make it harder, if you will, to do the 50s model of assimilation. But that doesn't mean that immigrants aren't prepared, as they're doing day in and day out, to become part of this country. Because as you look, first, second, third generation, the lack of Spanish speaking by the third generation, it's happening. So, but it is different. And we are impacting society in a different way.
Okay, there was a hand here, somebody, yes, sir.
Yes. Yes. What's different today is the policy of immigration and the practice of immigration. And until the end, you have completely ignored it. In the past, we have had immigration policies that were bad, and we've corrected them. Now, we completely ignore, prior to 9/11 and after 9/11, a very porous border. You can go down to Spencer's and hire anybody you want, and you don't have to pick on anybody. They are illegal immigrants. There's no question about it. And they are taking jobs away from our disadvantaged. We cannot educate the entire world. I agree that David and others have a perfect right, but let's change our policies so that the policies and practice are the same. The other alternative is Wendell Willkie's One World.
So don't we need borders, and don't we have both a right and an obligation to enforce them? Michael?
I'm just going to respond to one piece of your comment, and we have some people here who are very familiar with Napa and Sonoma. I invite them to comment if they'd like, but it's my understanding, and it's not just Napa and Sonoma, that we know the importance of California's agriculture to California and to the nation. And it's my understanding that large numbers of people who work those fields are not legally in this country. And the people who are in charge of those operations claim that they cannot get people who are legally in this country to work the fields in as effective a manner as the people who they're getting who are not here illegally. And therefore, ironically, there are major, and maybe this goes back to this is a different spin on the Wall Street crowd. There are major corporate interests here who are opposed to tightening because their livelihood is dependent on the continuous flow of, quote, illegal immigrants. So it's really complicated.
Think of the restaurant industry, think of the hotel industry, think of the construction industry, not just agriculture. And so the job corners are just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, essentially, there was a bad movie just that came out recently, but all that had a great argument.
What is it with you guys in these bad movies?
It was called A Day Without a Mexican.
Right.
And what would happen if all the Mexicans disappeared, in California? I mean, we just sort of grind to a halt. And that's the dilemma. Actually, that's the whole dilemma here with the whole immigration debate.
But why isn't the answer to this, Maria, raise the wage rates, raise minimum wage? I mean, ordinarily, isn't that what an economist would say? If you raise wages, if the problem is that growers, restaurateurs, construction companies can't find domestic, American or green card labor, maybe it's because they're not willing to pay a living wage.
it's,
Spenders, and they demand $10 an hour.
right. I was just going to say that actually, you were right about the practice versus the policy, and we've never been serious in this country about actually verifying having employers really be sure that they're hiring people who are legally entitled to here, and that's another set of discussions. But, but you've got some
Okay,
questions.
sir.
Well, I think, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think you've been beating a dead horse and avoiding the real issue. I mean, it's obvious that the American culture is bigoted and that we have a history of racism. The point of immigration is exactly that business wants an unlimited supply of cheap labor. And politically, there's no way I can see that you're going to avoid that. But the real problem is population. I can remember when the population of California was 7 million people. You could go out and have a great experience fishing and the rest of it. There's a limit to how many people can live in California, and I think we've already passed it. Okay, I am not a racist.
Okay. Who's
Most of my grandchildren are Mexican descent. My mother's family were immigrants. But to keep saying that anybody that's worried about population limits is just playing the racist line is not true.
Okay. This woman here, George, can
I'd like his response.
oh, go ahead, Lucas.
I agree with you that the problem is population. I don't think that migration and population are intertwined, though. There's a worldwide population issue we need to grapple with. It's not a question of migration. It's a question of the whole world. We need to deal with population control and feeding the people that we already have and having the right kinds of development and so on. That's a huge issue, but I don't think the answer is to try to build a fortress to deal with population growth, in brief. But I think it's a very good and very difficult question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the observation is correct, but the way the whole U.S. system works, we're not going to have an internal identity card yet, where population from one part of the country to another is regulated. I mean, in the Soviet Union, the entire history of the Soviet Union, from late 1918 till December 31st, 1991, when the Soviet Union went out of business, there was an internal security system. If you wanted to move from Moscow to Leningrad, you had to go to a government ministry, fill out forms, and they may get back to you in 20 or 30 years. You don't want that. But of course, California's resources are being strained enormously by headed toward 50 million people. On the other hand, when someone from Kansas comes here, we're not going to say, I'm sorry, we really have enough of you guys. You go back to Kansas. It's just, so the diagnosis is correct, but we don't have any chemo to solve the problem.
I wish we could tell Los Angeles to stop growing.
Yeah.
And stop taking our water. I mean,
Let's not go there.
who has the power though to say Los Angeles you can't grow anymore? I mean, we live in a different system.
We lost that power. I mean,
Yep.
San Francisco was the
Yep.
population center of California.
Yep.
And when Los Angeles got enough people that you could not vote them, they took the power base away, and that's why we're so...
It's called democracy. That's how it works. Just that democracy is something so
My
long.
first name is Cynthia, and this is a very difficult dilemma for me. I don't know where I stand on it, and every time they talk about immigration reform, it's just very difficult for me, and because I'm the product of immigrants from both sides. My grandmother made it by boat from Armenia to this country, so she left a refugee camp and she made it through this to this country. My father's from Canada. So, and there is an argument that this country is being overpopulated. I mean, and I don't think there's many dimensions. There's the national security threat, there's population growth, there's certainly an element of economics. So there's many, disciplines that come into play on this question. And I guess my question is what is different about this immigration growth, now versus like the 1920s when my great-grandparents came in? And there's the thought that when people came in, earlier in this last century, that for some reason they were more educated, or they brought more things to this country. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that I believe that, but there is that thought out there. So I wanted your comments, please.
David, do you?
I would argue there's hardly any difference. I mean, just the direction, the origin of the immigration is different, but in terms of numbers, there's hardly any difference.
On a proportionate basis.
Right, and also in terms of the hysteria, though, of the 1920s is what we're talking about. We're going through the resurgence right now. You can almost the same metaphors and images that were used to describe Eastern and Southern European immigrants are being used now to describe Latino immigrants.
And it led to the national origins quota system. I mean, it led to a law that for 40 years, 45 years really, explicitly limited immigration by race and by national origin. And so it is very, reminiscent of what, so I think part of what happens is, again, we look back and see and view immigration in the rearview mirror as very different than today, but at the time that it was happening, it felt much more like today and had the same kinds of reactions and so on. Michael?
Well, I think one of the, in a way, an illusion is, though, that, we can't handle this population, we're jammed. Just take a drive 15 minutes from here. This country's empty.
Right.
There's nobody here. We have 3,000 counties in the United States, and we have population centers in about 500 of them. In the presidential election of 2004, of the 3,000 counties, and this is not normally stuff that's put up on the board, 50 states we know, 2,000 counties we don't know, Bush won 2,500 of the 3,000 counties. Kerry won 500 counties. Kerry won primarily in high-populated areas. No, there were some exceptions there, high-populated areas, and Bush won in low, drive to upstate New York, leave, get into Westchester County. There's nobody there. There's nobody there. Go to Oregon, across the country, go to Montana. I mean, you've got a pittance of a population. So there's plenty of room. It's just that the people keep coming, want to come to L.A. and want to maybe come to the Bay Area. They want to come, the same 500 counties are where people, so it's, again, at the macro level, it's not a problem.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
I wanted to bring it back to what it means to be an American, and mention you had brought up Sonoma and Napa, Marin, those things. I worked as a youngster, my grandparents would take us from San Francisco up to pick prunes, and many low-income people would do that type of work. But what was pointed out earlier is the business community always wants cheaper labor, and they're going to take it no matter where it comes from. So I don't mind whoever comes here. What I want is that responsibility that if you're going to be here, that you pay a part of the situation. I was 12 years old when I got my Social Security card, and I paid Social Security in as a prune picker at 25 cents a lug. So now here we are in a situation that we have a government that tells us we don't have enough for Social Security. We have business interests that say we constantly have to keep wages cheaper. And we have a system that's kind of in disarray. So I wanted to ask you, if I believe what it means to be an American is to stand up, take responsibility, pay your taxes, even be drafted, if necessary, into a military that believes in national defense. Tell me what you think it takes responsibility for American.
Well, you're absolutely right. The system's completely broken, and what we need is comprehensive immigration reform. There are plenty of people who are working, but the way our system is set up, they can't get a Social Security card. So we need to do something about the 10 million people who are here illegally, who are working. And I want to just point out something. there, in the economic debate about our country, people are very concerned about outsourcing of jobs, right? Corporations and moving jobs overseas. Well, it's interesting, people attack the employers and the corporations for moving the jobs overseas. But we are insourcing labor. Corporations are finding it easier, they want cheaper labor, but we don't attack the corporations or criticize the employers for bringing in cheaper labor, we attack the immigrants. So it's that we're this disconnect. So we need also a legal means for bringing in labor when we need it. Agriculture, 60–70% of it is undocumented. Other industries, as David mentioned. A program that brings it in, that protects American workers, that sets wages so that you just aren't constantly bringing in people with different rights or that you can pay different wages. And that is really the debate that's going to be happening in Washington over the next year or so.
Talk about the taxpayers,
I wanna-
immigrants paying taxes and the Social Security.
Oh,
Oh,
yes,
that's what-
people don't realize that the Social Security, right, sorry. The surplus in the Social Security at the moment is over $400 billion that is unmatched. That is to say, it was collected from workers, but they can't really match it because the numbers that were used were false numbers. That all comes, mostly, a very significant part, comes from undocumented immigrants. They're propping up our Social Security system, and there was a recent New York Times article about a week ago about the degree to which immigrant labor is helping the Social Security system stay in the
David,
black.
you wanted to add something
I
quickly?
definitely wanted to underscore that. The Social Security system has basically been maintained by the unclaimed, wages by immigrants,
Ma'am, in back.
Yeah.
Last
Perhaps
question.
I'm wrong. I have the concept that a lot of the power base for the people who are advocating for immigration reform and for whom the Bush administration is trying to placate are very conservative and have fairly conservative social values and, in fact, are themselves part of the immigrant community. Am I wrong?
I mean, it's not, are you asking sort of the motivations for why Bush is wading into this area?
And why he has enough support for it.
He doesn't have enough support yet. Maybe we should just leave with this because you're going to see this over the next year or so. So remember this when you see the headlines. What President Bush is proposing is a guest worker program only, right? It sounds wonderful. You come in for 3 years, 6 years, and then you go home. It doesn't do anything about the people who are currently here, who are paying taxes, and it also doesn't recognize something very important. This is where I agree with the restrictionists. There's no such thing as a temporary program. Look, all the experience in Europe, look at our own experience. Life happens. People come, they meet someone, they marry. There's no such thing as a temporary worker program. So the question is, do we design a program that tries to regulate so that you appropriately bring in the numbers that you need and recognize that at a certain point, at their choice, they want to be part of this society. Maybe you set up 6 years, 8 years, whatever it is, and learn English, all those requirements, so that we don't have a problem 10 years from now, like we have now with a very large undocumented population. And I'll close. It is important that we do something about that 10 million, because if nothing else, the values that we have as Americans, right? We pride ourselves as a land of some justice, at least at our best moments. How do we tolerate having 10 million people without rights, without any rights, and that we are effectively making use of?
On that note, let me thank you all very much for coming to this workshop, and enjoy the rest of Cal Day. Go Bears.
And I'd like to thank Chris Edley, Michael Nacht, Maria Chaveste David, and Lucas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.